Okay, again, welcome everybody to day two of our mini conference. And thank you all for hanging in with us and being there. Some new people are joining us today. We'll carry on. We remember that we are recording, so that if you do want to listen again or see them both in tandem, you can do that. So Sarah will let us know when that happens. It's my pleasure to introduce today Amy Earhart, who is a HBW board member and has been with us pretty much from the beginning of this project in terms of helping us to secure the kind of funding and to bring all of you on board. And this is a very quick introduction. Amy has more than 20 articles, lots of work she's been doing. In 2010, her book, The American Literature Scholar and the Digital Age, came out. Her 2015 book, Traces of the Old, Uses of the New, The Emergence of Digital Literary Studies, and her very exciting new book, Work in Progress, Can a Computer Be Racist? Interesting. Maybe she can tell us a little bit about that. So I will let Amy take it over from here, and she's going to be the moderator for today's panels. And thank you all again for joining us.
Thanks, Mary Emma. It's always great to be here. Yesterday was wonderful, and thank you all for giving me a much needed break in the middle of the scramble to keep my students on track and to meet some deadlines that are happening. So I look forward to another really great day with each of you. So what I thought I would do is introduce each of the, we have two papers for today, and I was going to introduce each of the participants with the projects. And I'm sorry, I have a cat here who thinks she needs to be part of the introduction as well. So the first paper we will have today will be, oh, before I forget, I almost forgot. So yesterday we had a pretty robust discussion on chat about Twitter. And two things, if you would like to share your Twitter handle on the group chat, that would be great. I followed a few new folks today, and that was yesterday, and that was really exciting. Also, for each of you presenting your work today, if you could let us know if it would be okay to tweet about your work. No one will tweet about it until you give permission. And it's okay to say no if you feel your work is too preliminary, that you don't want that going out on Twitter. That's fine too. So just let us know as you get started. So, and we're off. The first presentation we will have will be Digital Humanities Limitations, Refining Methods for Research and Teaching. And we have three presenters. I'm going to introduce each of them. Susan Weber works on 20th and 21st century African American and Caribbean literature. Her current book project, Poetics of Interruption, Media and Form in Black Radical Literature, examines experimental Black diasporic literature's engagement with other media, particularly music, film, and photography. Susan also writes about race in science fiction and the Haitian Revolution. Currently a postdoc fellow at the University of Oregon, Susan has also worked and taught at the University of Rochester and Penn State. Presenting with her is Ebony Pero, who is a humanities PhD candidate at Clark Atlanta University. Her concentrations include Africana Women's Studies and English. She received her bachelor's and master's degree in English from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Her research interests include Black feminist theory, Black feminist literary criticism, and 20th and 21st century Black women's literature. Her dissertation focuses on literary representations of Black girl rage. She is Dr. C. Silone Quito Fellow for the National Council for Black Studies and teaches English and Humanities at Clark Atlanta University. Our third presenter today is Joyce Wright. She's originally from Miami, Florida, and is a PhD candidate in humanities with a primary focus in African American studies at Clark Atlanta University. Her research interests include 19th, 20th, and 21st century literature, including African American literature and Caribbean, as well as African cosmological and spiritual continuities in the diaspora. Currently, Ms. White is working on her dissertation, which will examine select text of Edwidge Danticat. She earned a BA in English as well as an MA in English with a focus in creative writing and literature from Florida State. So thank you all for presenting today, and I will turn things over to you.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and share my screen with our PowerPoint. Let's see. Uh-oh. Can y'all see it or is it cut off?
Yes, cut off.
It's cut off. Yeah, it's like half of it. I wonder.
Well, there it is.
Yeah.
Okay, let me try one more time. That's weird.
I think I've had a problem when I've taught in Zoom, and I think if you don't make it full screen, but you like make it most of your screen, it will not cut it off.
I think that's right. It's up under the view options at the very top.
There we go.
Nice.
Okay. Perfect. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I guess that depends on where you are. That's with a lot of research projects, conference presentations, things shift, ideas shift, inspiration shifts, and we shift. So I'll start by saying, actually, both Joyce and I have completed our dissertations. I am now at Tulane University in the English department. But again, like I said, things shift. So our original title, Digital Humanities, Limitations, Refining Methods for Research and Teaching, was actually revised and refined to fit the new directions of our work. Though we still nod to research and teaching, we'll think about the metadata categories that we were given at the beginning of the project and kind of thinking about revising and revisiting that biographical data and lean into some intersectional and diasporic conversations. We're also playing on the various modes of site. So site as in website, a nod to digital humanities, site as in location and visibility, and also equally important, the politics of citation, how shifting the categories can move us into conversations about the ways we resist the muting of our narratives and the burying of our stories in big data. So I just wanted to let you all know that we kind of shifted a little bit, but I think that's a natural thing as you explore and discover new content that you're interested in. Now, this may be a little bit unorthodox, but for me, I think that it's necessary because of the work that I do. Always shout out Black women, and I came across this really interesting tweet here that says, digital humanities, remember that field, Black women will dominate it. And we're sitting here 3 odd years later after this tweet, and I've seen a lot of work in digital humanities for Black women and by Black women. So I think that this is a good thing that is spoken into existence and kind of takes us back to even thinking about the literary tradition. So much like Black women's foray into the literary realm, we're kind of doing the same thing in DH, where we're disrupting these one-dimensional narratives and doing what Cheryl Wall has said that we've tried to do for a very long time, focusing on this 400 years of our history and recuperating Black women's stories and the stories of Black folk in general. So these digital spaces are starting to create these digital counter canons that provide access to those narratives and the knowledge, and giving us some leanings into the genealogical connections that illuminate the digital diaspora. So with this in mind, we seek to illuminate how Black folk, how women tell their stories, how these stories manifest in the digital humanities, and how those who engage in DH do some mapping of the digital margin. So that's a nod to Kimberly Crenshaw, of course, and how we start to do what Ruth Nicole Brown says as charting a new course for the discipline by featuring these previously marginalized voices and perspectives, which is, of course, very important through the course of this experience, through the course of watching other people's presentations. We've talked a lot about recovery work and reclamation. So we've asked kind of similar questions to, or thinking in similar themes as other groups, but thinking about the ways that Black digital humanists and people that engage in Black DH in general are decolonizing and doing some resistance work in DH. And with that, we have to ask, what stories can we tell with that data? And then thinking about the Black Book Interactive Project at large, what categories should be included in the corpus? And these all kind of fold into each other, because looking at the metadata allows us to figure out what stories are being told, and how we can use that metadata to tell larger stories, to see how we're doing this resistance work and how we're engaging in these decolonial practices in DH. But we have to also acknowledge that the corpora are not created in a vacuum. They are what Brown calls socio-political entities. So we have to acknowledge the limitations of those, but we also want to acknowledge the possibilities. When we think about some early DH work, we talk about race as a factor in the digital divide. Newer criticism, we think more broadly and more intersectionally in terms of representation at large. So our project is kind of looking for the ways and methods to bridge those gaps, reinterpreting the corpus as that socio-political entity, and thinking about those various modes of sight and how we can utilize those to combat that erasure of our narratives, which is some of the larger goal of our project, and then I think this entire conversation that we're all having. And keeping that in mind, I thought about my research and my teaching, so not letting go of the ideas that we grappled with at the beginning of our project, but also thinking about how we can use all of this wealth of information and do some application work. So what I'm going to show you now is just how I envision utilizing the corpus, utilizing the knowledge that has been given, and relating it to, again, my research and my teaching. So what you see here are some shots that I took from philologic, engaging in rage in particular, because that's what I'm familiar with, that's my research. And I think in this time and space, it's important to theorize about rage because we're in a very unique moment. So I kind of bring my research into the classroom, and I see this corpus really enhancing that. So in Stories Are Data with Soul, Lessons from Black Feminist Epistemology, Saranji Nader explains that the relevance of narrative analysis to Black feminist research is that it provides an analytical technique for accessing and recognizing knowledge, and by extension, the counter narratives embedded in that knowledge. She argues narrative can be researched itself, or narrative can be used as a research method to produce data. She writes that narrative analysis expands the boundaries of research through the story mode. Now, this is a mode and method that I see as very important to teaching my students research and showing them how we can utilize this corpus. So STORY stands for Suspicion of Master Narratives of Knowledge, Tools for Knowledge Gathering and Dissemination, which this has been very useful as that. Objection to objectivity, reflexivity and positioning of the researcher, and yearning for and working for transformation and change, which is one of those key things that I emphasize in my classroom. I think that this does a good job of that. But we can also think of the ways, since she says that stories are data with soul, we can look at how we can insert soul into that data by telling the stories that the data kind of puts forth, and looking at those stories it tells through these, what Brown calls socio-political corpora. So again, I went into this corpus with that mindset and looking at it with eyes that said, what kinds of texts can we pull from here? What new text does it provide for teaching and research? Of course, it allows me to look beyond the 20th and 21st century and see how these Black women writers, how writers in general, Black writers in general, are talking about rage. And I think it's important to address here the ways that the philologic allows us to visualize the text. That's good for my students in terms of accessibility, because some of them need to see the way these words are framed next to each other, see that context and content. And that allows them to think about that in new ways that might not necessarily spring up if they're just looking at it in a plain printed text. And then this wonderful timeline here can be used to look at not only the frequency of the rage in the text, but thinking about it historically, the 60s and the 70s, Beverly Guy Sheftall calls them the angry decades. So I can tell my students, hey, look at this corpus and look at the uptick in the conversations of rage in the 60s and the 70s. Now we know that that is a result of what's in the corpus, but it allows them to go out and explore and think about the things that are going on outside of the corpus. Let's go and see, why are people in the 60s so angry? Is this something that matches up with this corpus? So it just gives them some things to consider. So we can say, let's pull these texts that are connected and think about how we can look at them in terms of the metadata in some way. So let's pull, say, all of the Black women's texts and see what stories they tell, and go back and fill those gaps. And it gives them richer research and things to consider. And it reminds me that I tell them a lot about Cheryl Wall's work and how she indicates that Black women writers are rereading the African-American and African-American literary traditions and thinking about what Adrienne Rich calls revision, the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes, of entering an old text from a new direction. The corpus gives us that. It gives me that new direction in telling stories about Black literature, Black lives, Black moments and movements in the field. And then even more so, revising that metadata, those metadata categories can lead us to those new directions.
Hi, everybody. So this is my part. And as Ebony reflected, our project took on a more theoretical posture to the ideas of revision and how we use basically the biographical categories that were already established for data mining. And what we began to find really is that DH critical theory really already challenges these assignments of categories or static descriptors and ideations of identity. And to really kind of give a background for some of our conversations and how we envisioned moving this project forward and the ideas that we had, it brought me back, this project really brought me back to just not too long ago in my PhD work. I have a PhD in humanities, but my concentration is African American studies, and the interconnections between these two and the interactions between the two fields is not necessarily always organic. And one of the things that I was thinking about is in the humanities, which is interdisciplinary at its very core, right? I was often asked sometimes to study and engage theories, methods, and methodologies that like social Darwinism or evolutionary psychology that reduce text to a universality of human behavior, right? And it's the assumption in this is that the reduction will make a cleaner and a more streamlined analysis that engages these searchable, measurable, but most importantly to me, one of the things that really stuck out was the pattern, that it would create some sort of clear pattern that we could use to search. And this was done a lot of times without any regard to the cultural or historical contributions that were factors within the text. And this was in direct conflict, obviously, with the cultural and historical underpinnings and foundations of African-American studies that I was also engaging. And the disconnection I experienced is echoed in Towards the Black Digital Humanities by Noble, where she argues that at the same time that we call on DH scholars to engage African Black diaspora studies, she's also calling on African Black diaspora studies scholars who don't necessarily align with digital humanities to contribute to this project. And it's an important idea because, and it's important to our aims here, really as an entire collective for BBIP, but then also for our particular project, because we're continually discussing representation and what it means to center, what it means to recover, what it means to make these texts visible. Because in the written canon, they're on the periphery, but we're also finding then in the digital, they're also on the periphery. So, the idea of considering how we categorize text or even biographical information it's really foundational to the idea of how we might make these texts more visible and recenter them in a place they're easier to recover because of the patterns that they create. And so when we were talking about this, we talked a lot about the functionality of the entity of categories in biography as it relates to identity. And what we did was we took up the charge to explore the additional categories of biography that was on the BBIP spreadsheet. So what we gleaned really from our early discussions is how we might use two particular categories like race and gender that are often talked about and discussed in critical digital humanities theory, how they might be reimagined, how we might extend possibilities of being able to identify these texts through even the descriptors that we use in biography. And so we began to position our aims within current DH theory, and it struck me that, I've read this before, or I had this idea has, been in my brain before, and I thought about bell hooks. And in 1990, she addresses the idea of the lacking inclusivity of Black literature within the postmodern movement. And in particular, she's concerned with the function of language, the written and spoken language, and how that language often, she says that often she finds herself outside of the discourse, right? And the Black writers and Black voices that she's addressing outside of the discourse, they're on the margins and they're decentered. And she argues that as a discursive practice, it's dominated primarily by the voices of white male intellectuals and or academic elites who speak to and about one another with coded familiarity. So all of these things really brought up to me ideas about how we can kind of reimagine and not get ourselves get ourselves in the same position, right? Where we're speaking to each other with some sort of coded familiarity, or, texts are being spoken about and coded familiarity, and it's used as a tool to decenter because it's not really taking into consideration some of the things that Hooks was even talking about in 1990, which, by the way, 1991 marks the sort of digital age as, the internet becomes public. So these, this reverberation of what Hooks is saying in the 1990s is coming up even in 2019 in texts like Towards the Digital Black Humanities, where, these notions frame the intention of our project to re-theorize and the ways in which we use category in the DH work. More specifically, it really, tasked us to ask the question if the given and chosen categories we have do the job and the function we intend them to do, or whether it is worthy of our time to renegotiate them, recategorize them, re-understand them in this moment, so that these assigned categories like race and gender don't reinforce identities that can be manipulated and decentered within the current canon, and where voices, as we've talked about time and time again on these presentations, that wonderful presentations, by the way, that I've been hearing, where these voices are on the margin, and they can be decentered altogether. And if the reinforcement of these categories is used, like I was finding in my studies as a student, to universalize literature in a way where they're not considering lived experiences and authentic representations, the danger is the mutation or the muting of and the unsearchability and being able or not being able to identify these texts within the masses of texts and the boundlessness of DH. And so to quote Noble, it kind of sums it up for me. She argues that the digital humanities can profoundly alienate Black people from participating in this work because of its silences and refusals to engage in addressing the intersection dimensions of policies, economics, and the intersectional racial and gender oppression that are a part of the society we live in. And so, her, central question is, can the digital be decolonized? Can we do that? And by looking at the categories within biography and thinking about the job and their intention, we must also think about their functionality and also the interpretation, on the other side when we are mining for data as it relates to particularly Black texts. We've responded to this call through our analysis of the corpora, and that centers Black and diasporic studies. And that's reflected in the methodology used when considering categories utilized for searching tools. And one of the solutions, and I'm going to turn it over to Susan after this, and one of the solutions that I found useful was Laura Mandel in Gender and Cultural Analytics and Finding or Making Stereotypes. She says that basically we need to thaw the typographical fixity via computer screens, moving from private to public. Scholarly dynamic interactions offer us a chance to contest discursive constructions like sex, gender, and sexuality at the very moment of their construction. And so what we really wanted to, I really wanted to utilize, that idea to propose, a revision and a rethinking of the categories that we use in order to do the critical work that we are doing in, in DH. And thinking about how we might use these categories as a way to recenter, recenter Black literature within the canon, and not re-emphasize the marginality of the authors in the text that we're often kind of discussing not only in critical theory, but in practice, as we see with a lot of the projects that we, wonderful projects, again, that were so inspiring yesterday. But to think very foundationally then how we begin, even how we begin these projects, and what kind of words and wording and coded language might be a result, not a malicious result, but just a result of not really thinking about how these things might center a project from the foundation up. I'll turn it over to Susan.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ebony and Joyce. So as you can sort of see and hear from what Joyce and Ebony have been suggesting, rather than creating a digital humanities project that was interactive, our group is interested in a kind of having a theoretical conversation, maybe the start of what can become a co-written article or something like that, but having a conversation about the way that the metadata itself is approached, is constructed, is thought about in this BBIP database. We want to rethink some of the assumptions, especially because we were given the category biography, and this is a category of metadata that's just really ripe for reimagining what metadata can do. In early conversations, we noticed a tension between new categories we wanted to add and an imperative toward clarity, transparency, and searchability, words that you've already heard Joyce use. We were interested in adding categories, for example, like political and social networks, in tracking authors' political affiliations, but we're sometimes cautioned that this would make the data too messy, not searchable. Words like this kept coming up. And so right from the beginning, there was a tension between searchability, clarity, and transparency, and what we thought might be the most interesting and rich kind of metadata terms that might really allow people to do something new with BBIP's database. So again, there was this tension between transparency or clarity and what was deemed to be maybe messier or less searchable metadata. And we realized eventually that if we wanted the metadata to be clear and transparent, that would mean simply reusing older metadata that had already been used. We kept coming back to original metadata that often just had male and female for gender, and ethnicity was usually just African American. Well, what would it mean to kind of reimagine some of these things? And the kind of short answer that I'll get to towards the end of this short presentation is that we want to kind of dwell in some messiness and maybe make room for some messiness within the metadata category. We want to ask who benefits from clean data, and in what ways do imperatives toward clarity or cleanness, transparency, and searchability smuggle ideas about universality in through the back door. So one of the things that has been kind of inspiring for me in thinking about these questions is work on queering digital humanities. Critical race, gender, and queer studies scholars, and this is now to my slide, call for new metadata categories and vocabulary, so for an additive approach. But it's also suggests that an additive approach isn't enough. In other words, it's not just enough to add more metadata, but it's important to also reimagine and sort of like queer that metadata itself. What does this look like? It seems to suggest two kind of changes, one of which Ebony and Joyce have both already focused on, and that so many of our other presentations from yesterday have touched on, this emphasis on recovering counter histories and centering subjects who have otherwise been decentered. But the second part of this, the part that I'll focus on more in my part of the presentation, is critically interrogating imperatives toward transparency, resisting the urge toward fixity and completion, and embracing more messiness and openness in our categories, data, and methods. So you can go to the next slide, if you can, Ebony. So again, the first part of this is recovering counter histories. And there's a long history of this in both Black DH, queer DH, and importantly in intersectional DH, which is interested in thinking intersectionally about race, gender, and sexuality. And I think our presentations in BBIP have done a really good job of highlighting this sort of really important recovery work. Ruberg, Boyd, and Howe highlight, for example, recent DH projects that have directly addressed queer issues and queer history. For example, the Lesbian and Gay Liberation Canada project, which has an interactive map of queer activism in Canada. And they say that this brings queer history to life, reanimating it via dynamic digital interfaces. So again, there's this opportunity to tell counter histories, to highlight stories that otherwise haven't been highlighted, and to visualize those things and make them real and accessible to people. You can go to the next slide now too. But part two involves not just sort of recovering, but then actually thinking about what it would mean to radically reimagine or to queer the metadata categories themselves. So this is a quote from Bodies of Information, Intersectional Feminism, and the Digital Humanities. To queer metadata, queer thinking must be brought to bear on the conceptual models and tools of object description, in this case, the very metadata that we use, to challenge the norms that dictate how meaning is derived from data. The methods with which data are traditionally mapped rely on a model of a one-to-one relationship between concepts of the world that can account for non-binary relationships. What I want to say here is that some excellent work has been done on DH and race, again, as so many of our presentations have already highlighted. However, much of this work has had to contend with the limitations of traditional metadata, those limitations I gestured to earlier that often say sort of male or female for gender and white or African American for ethnicity. Our group was wondering, well, what would it look like if we actually radically reimagined the metadata itself? In Going Meta on Metadata, a very punny titled article by Michael J. Kramer, he asks what happens if we understand metadata not as objective, but or merely descriptive, but as already on their way to interpretation. The fact that the metadata, the categories that we use, are already on their way to interpretation, are already interpreting, not just describing, means that we really need to think carefully about reimagining our metadata. And this is particularly important with metadata that deals with identity and representation. You can go to the next slide now. Thank you, Ebony. Another quote from, it looks like my quote attribution got cut off here, but this is also Michael J. Kramer. The convergence of mediated forms within the digital domain asks us to open up what we call an archive rather than close it down, particularly in an era when both corporations and the governments are using large official digital archives for data mining of human individuals. We need to assert that the archives should be understood as a kind of commons, not a tool of totalized mastery and secretive information. Transparency and privacy must be renegotiated in the new technological structures of the digital archive. And despite the pressures of standardization and homogenization that the digital demands in order to function, we need to insist that it adjust to and respect more quirky, messy, and unofficial modes of archivization as well. So again, we're asking, what would it look like if some of this quirkiness and messiness actually worked its way into the metadata itself? How can we allow queer theory, intersectional feminist thought, and critical race studies to reshape our DH methodologies and theories, and in this case, particularly the metadata categories around biography and identity? one more slide. I think this is my last slide. An example of this, and I've talked about the metadata categories for race and gender, but gender, I think in particular, is interesting to Ruberg, Boyd, and Howe in their chapter Toward a Queer Digital Humanities. They point out that the rules for cataloging gender, as well as other identity markers, run counter to current work in gender and queer theory, critical race studies, and activist work. For example, cataloging rules suggest that each author has a single gender that can be captured by the cataloger. This cataloging also then fixes that gender, so you're either male or female, and that's it, and that doesn't change. And so it's a fixed category within a binary system. And one of the things that Ebony and Joyce and I want to think about is, what does it mean if in our classrooms we are asking students their preferred pronouns, respecting the ways that people identify, but then teaching them these DH databases that still suggest that the only genders available are male and female, and that those are fixed and don't change. These forms of attention to difference get us to a certain understanding of how gender, race, and other formations inhabit digital systems, but they ignore something deeper, namely the power dynamics inscribed in those information systems themselves. So I guess another sort of subtitle of or at least of my part of this presentation could be kind of in favor of messiness, in favor of flux, in favor of, instead of fixity, something else. And what we want to ask is, what would it look like to let some of that messiness actually inhabit and reshape some of our metadata categories? And so we're going to sort of transition into the last part of our presentation into thinking about the practical applications of this theoretical stuff. And we have some ideas about how we can reimagine those categories. I think this is probably a good point for me to turn it back to Joyce, I think. Yes. This is your slide, right, Joyce?
Sorry, trying to unmute myself. So I thought about, just as a practical example, Octavia Butler, who, love and adore. But, Octavia Butler is often speculated about, her sexuality is often speculated about. Also, she's described or attributed as being a lesbian. And she self-identifies, though, in 1998. She doesn't identify as a lesbian, and she told Larry McCaffrey in another, in a 1998 interview, that she had thought about her sexuality and her sense of gender, and that she might be indeed what others had called her, right? But she said she had even gone twice to the Gay and Lesbian Services Center to talk about these things, at which point she realized, no, this ain't it. Those are her words. And she says, I'm a hermit. So her own self-identification really is a great example of the ways in which categories will keep people within a margin or within a particular, category that they don't even use themselves. And so, I love this quote, every story I create creates me. I write to create myself. So as we're talking about text and creators of these texts, we also need to be, I think, thinking very forwardly about how we create ways in which we're, helping them, helping us to find them within the digital humanities, and, terms and identifiers that don't bind or create a binary in which, there's some limitations there, but that are open and that can continue to be recreated. So I just wanted to kind of give that example as a practical way to kind of look at this and, what a practical application of this might be. I mean, I don't know that we would have to have a column for hermits, as Octavia Butler describes herself. But, it's a good example of the ways in which we might want to think about how people self-identify themselves. These were just some of these were the current BBIP biographical categories that we dealt with. And there was one last one, which was additional categories, which is where we really seem to have flourished. Our entire presentation was really just on the additional categories. You can go ahead. And so some of the ways we thought about reimagining or even additional categories that we're calling diasporic reimagining are just self-identifications or identifiers, ethnicity, race, sexualities, or possibly even leaving it blank. So that if the author hasn't stated what they are or how they identify or the pronouns they use or whatever, that there's a place, you know, as Susan said, that you can leave it blank, and it might be messy, it might not be, you know, searchable, but that it's there. And so these are just some of the other areas: regionality, citizenship, political affiliations, religious beliefs, literary movements, periods, peers, and links to other DH projects and sites that might be a good way to help expand the ways of the categories that we use in order to search for data. And I think I will turn that over to Ebony.
It's always a task to unmute, but just kind of going off of what Joyce said, there's such an expansiveness in thinking about these diasporic reimaginings. Just this morning, I was thinking about Alice Walker came to me and I said, is there a possible way to incorporate in the metadata some of the theoretical interventions that these fiction writers have made? Because some of them are not just fiction writers. So can we talk about the other things that they've done? Alice Walker has given us womanism, a lens, a framework, some theories that we could talk about and think about in conversation with this other metadata. So I think the messiness is helpful for those of us who like to get dirty and dig in the mud and let these things guide us, let these conversations guide us, let the data kind of guide us to some greater knowledge. And then since we're thinking about expanding the reach, and that's kind of one of the underpinnings of this project at large, we talked about what are some of the things that we could leave for a new biography group in re-envisioning those categories. Again, aligning with some critical DH and critical race theories. And that linking of those DH projects is really central to defining that digital diaspora and thinking about, is there any continuity in these projects? And for me, I always kind of go back to Black women. I think about some of the work that Dr. Stephanie Evans has done with these Black travel memoirs and her Africana memoirs databases. What are the themes that can arise from looking at these side by side or juxtaposing these projects? And then it can help us think about what's missing from these current lists and these current DH projects, and really think about how to expound and expand and think about Black digital humanities as a process and a project of liberation for us.
Okay, are we? I didn't.
I think.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful, and I think we probably have some time for questions, comments, if anyone would like to respond.
I have a question. This is Conrad. I'm looking at what you all are saying, and my concern is that when you all are trying to expand the categories on how people are named, as far as maybe their sexuality or race or something to that effect, and when it comes to intersectionality, sometimes I notice some Black feminists now are complaining that Black women are being marginalized all over again in that word, you know, from being lifted from Kimberly Crenshaw. If we're going to expand the categories, can this possibly be used against Black women to deracialize them and say, oh, well, it's just human? And to take away all of the background and historical evidence that has created who they are, their identity, their canons and their work and things like that. Can this be used against Black women? And that's my concern, because I've seen Black women in feminist circles get marginalized and pushed to the side. And looking at Mrs. America, I'm really on Hulu, I'm really seeing that, you know, how it got pushed, you know, to the side, one person is put up, and the battles that always came down to race. So I'm just curious how you all see that.
I think, well, I'll just begin. I just think one of the things that I'm thinking about is if we are, in charge of kind of centering these categories and narratives, then it's up to us to really continually revise them, continually look at them, don't take them as something static. And I think that that's really kind of, for me, that's really the way that I see this. And I think I can speak for our group, I hope I can. And that's really the kind of way that we're envisioning this. Keep it messy so that we can continually go in and revise to match what's currently happening, both in, in the current theoretical moment, in the canon, in the literary moment, but then also in these spaces that deal with, specifically in race and gender, so that, we're matching up on all sorts of levels, right? And that we're keeping it we're keeping ourselves in the conversation and keeping things visible by continually revising and recreating and rethinking it, and not taking things as static, because I think that's where people get, these calls for universality start to come up, is when we keep things the way that they have always been, and then that language starts to be coded for something else and, marginalizes or, subsumes a voice.
I think what you're pointing to is so important. And, Mary Emma mentioned the project I'm working on right now, and it really is looking at very much the same kind of question. And I've been thinking a lot about the TEI, which a lot of the BBIP discussions have centered on, and the way they have encoded metadata. And it's so important to keep pressing on these questions, because I know that when I pulled the original NEH funding document for the TEI, it was sort of shocking to see who was involved. I mean, as you might imagine, it was mostly white men from particular disciplines. But what was really shocking to me was that there was no one representing literary scholarship, no one representing literary editing. Those folks came on board later. So the very foundations of things like TEI, which we use over and over and over again, are sort of formed to not even consider the questions we're asking. And, I know Mary Emma has been very concerned with how to rethink these metadata issues to include other stories. And I think what you're pointing to is a real problem, because are you always on the periphery when you're trying to revise what's already there? Or is there a way to recenter the kinds of work we're interested in and sort of move that center from what we've had in DH for like the last 35, 40 years? And it's a real issue. And I appreciate very much that you're pressing on that, especially sort of looking toward queer theory and the way gender is encoded. There was a really great early conversation with TEI where we discovered that when you encoded gender, that men were 1 in the encoding structure and women were 2. And we joked about women were actually truly the second sex, even within the encoding guidelines. So thank you all for this really great press on encoding. And I'm really curious to see what comes next, because I think you're moving us in a really important direction.
Yeah, I agree. I think you all have put, first of all, your finger on the serious pulse that is very problematic. And we have gone back and forth on this, and we did a workshop in the fall. Saritha, who else was at that workshop? A few, Marina, I think Marina and Alicio, you might have come a little later, but we did a workshop in trying to think through, and Conrad, to think about how would we address this question of metadata. And I'm not able, because my technology is a little weak today, I can't share with you an article that came to us, and it's called In Search of Zora, when metadata is not enough. I think that's the subtitle of it. I mean, I actually have it here. When metadata isn't enough, that's what it is. When metadata isn't enough, and I'll send you the link, because it was it was presented to us in a discussion with HathiTrust. Some of you know that we've been super critical of HathiTrust because of what they say they have and what they don't have, and we know they don't have. And they discovered they don't know what they don't have. And the reason they don't know they don't have, because they don't have sufficient metadata to find what they don't have. So it's a circle here. So we are technically supposed to be working with them to come up with, to address this problem. But in the meantime, this article popped up. And there are a group of librarians who work together, and I really want all of us to look at it. And as I said, I'll send you the link, but that's the title of it, because they are raising the question of whatever metadata we use, it hasn't worked. And so and they took an example, and they found maybe 40 or 50 titles in HathiTrust that would have been overlooked based on the system they were using. Well, we know their system is very, very basic anyway. It doesn't even go as far as ours is way beyond theirs. But this is a question that I don't know how to answer it, because we love to embrace the messiness. We've been using that term a lot. We love that. But we also have to clean up our database, and Jade is here. That's something she talks about, because we can't work with it. We don't have the ability to work with it when it's so messy. I think it works when you're doing individual projects and you carve out a core of text, a corpus that you want to look at. I think it works. But we're now up to about 4,000 titles. How do we then practically bring this knowledge to these 4,000 titles? What do we use? How do we organize the information in a descriptive manner so that at least it provides some modicum of information for people who want to do research or want to pull titles based on certain descriptors? So it is a problem. And I greatly appreciate your addressing it in this way, because it does mean that we are on the right track in saying that this is the biggest problem that we face. We can keep finding titles and they're coming to us every day. But at the same time, if we are going to create a working database that is most useful to people, how do we get over this hump? Because this is a big one. Mm-hmm. So I'm just putting it out there, and I said I'll share the article with you so that you all can at least see what they did and how they took one text, or they took one idea, but it generated about 30 or 40 texts using the system they did. But I think it's useful. And I found it informative, just in terms of practically addressing a problem and sharing it, in an article with us. So I'll send it to you.
And I think one of the things I found really inspiring about one of the chapters I was working with was that they were very careful about what kind of messiness they were calling for. And so one of the kind of less helpful versions of messiness they draw attention to is that sometimes in one of the standard databases they're thinking about, gay can be used to mean queer, but it can also be used to only mean gay men. And so sometimes it's like used as an umbrella term for gay and lesbian, and then sometimes only for men. And so that's a kind of messiness that's not only unhelpful, but it flies in the face of current, queer studies work. And so I think what we're calling for, and this maybe also goes back to Conrad's question, is that it's a willingness to kind of adjust and change the categories, but it's still grounded in the specificity of critical race studies, queer studies, current best practices. But, what would it look like to still have, specific categories under maybe the metadata category of sexuality, but just allow for a more specific range of what types of kind of identifiers you can use under the category sexuality. So it's not just like gay or straight, but that it actually acknowledges the range of ways that people self-identify, which I think also goes back to Conrad's question, because if you do this kind of work in a community of scholars who are grounded in the work, as I think Joyce and Ebony were both saying too, you make sure that you're not then further contributing to the erasure of Black feminist work, right? But that you're actually highlighting the kind of range of work that falls under the umbrella of Black feminist intersectional work.
I briefly looked at my notes from that article, because I had gleaned it earlier when we were working on a proposal. And one of the things that they suggested is that you have to combine approaches. So if metadata is very problematic, then statistical modeling is the proper approach that they use together with that. And that's what generated much more useful information for them. So somehow you have to figure out, you can't rely on one thing alone. You have to do, you have to put that which gives you the best information together. I'm still dealing with, as what I said, we have so many, and we have yet to be able to provide that kind of information for any. I mean, maybe 200 texts. Somebody, if Jade is on the screen, she can tell me. We have not been able to do much of what we wanted to do. We were very ambitious when we started. When cohort 1 started, we wanted everybody to plunge in and do the metadata, and we quickly discovered that that was just not going to work, even with the categories that we had come up with. So as I said, I mean, I think we're going to keep working at this and figuring out practically how to make this happen. So, but other people, I think, yeah, somebody else. Jada, you had some comments. It seems like you had something to say.
I did. Well, you all are really heavily academic, and I came from a different world. And I just want to say I appreciate the work, and it is important. And I indexed for ProQuest for a long while, and I have to say that, yeah, there's no messiness. There's no room for combining. I mean, sexuality, forget that. I mean, they don't even get into that. I mean, I can say one example is that I was indexing something and I wanted to indicate that it was about people who are Black and British. And they were like, well, you can't do that because we don't have the capacity to indicate they're both Black and British. People could only be from one country in the system I was using, and you could indicate they were British, but there was no way to say that they were both Black and British or Nigerian and British or whatever the case may be. And it was just like, but that's the thing I was indexing was all about their identity as Black British people, but I was not able to indicate that in the indexing because it wasn't possible in the system that we had. So you do have to start somewhere and hope that eventually the work fans out and reaches out to, even the big corporate things like ProQuest, because yeah, there's so much that you cannot indicate that people aren't going to be able to find because things like ProQuest don't allow for that to happen.
And I think what you're saying is really important because what we need to have is a linked data system where we can indicate shifts over time and place, both historically and in terms of the way terms changes, like terms will change over time, like Susan's indicating. And that's possible, but it's tricky as you're designing these systems. So I'm curious to see and anxious to see your thinking about how one can align time, space, movement identity. I think a lot about Toomer with this, like how many different identities does he inhabit in his life? So I think you're going to have a lot of really great theoretical thinking that we all need to engage with as we move forward. Are there any other questions before we move on to the next?
I had one other comment.
Conrad?
Go ahead.
Because as a librarian, I can tell you it is extremely slow to change terms. I was looking at something when I was at, it took them a long time to move from Afro-American to African-American, and a Library of Congress is usually the last person to know. It's just that, and I'm not trying to attack librarians. I've been a librarian for years in various capacities, but they can be very rigid in how they interpret things, and they want one word because it's easier for them to code it. And so, but we're getting into computerized systems now that can allow for, like Joyce and larger fields of words that can give you a larger opportunity to access a particular subject from a particular angle of stuff. But we can, as a field, we're dragging, we're kicking and screaming.
Yeah, I was just going to say that our very first grant, as some of you know, was written to create a metadata schema that would account, and we said race. Now that was not the limitation, but that was the way we presented it. And we quickly discovered that we could only go so far with that concept. And now we're at the point that saying, if you just say race, it's not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And so even though that grant, of course, is over, and we do have the present system we have came out of that initial grant, you learn by doing. And what we've learned, as I said, is that that will no longer work. So at this point, working with people who are much more the engineers and the statisticians and the people who really can help us create a system. And that's where our networking and our partnerships are now going, working with people who can create more fluid or flexible systems that allow what we want to do. Because currently, what we're given doesn't work. Conrad has spoken to that, the difficulty of those who are charged with that, it doesn't work. So we have to, in a sense, design our own system, but make it interoperable so that other people can access it as well. Because that's the other problem. You will isolate yourself if you make a perfect system, but only you can access it, only you can work with it. But you want it to be able to talk and communicate with other systems. That's beyond my pay grade. But I'm willing to go to the people who can do it. That's what I think I'm pretty good at, is finding the people who know how to do that.
Well, thank you all. That was a great discussion, and
great.
I hope we can continue these conversations. So I think what we'll do is we'll head along to our second paper for today. And we will be hearing about Operating in the Black, a computational archive and the Black digital turn. We have two presenters. Dr. Jacinta R. Saffold, is an assistant professor of English at the University of New Orleans. She received her PhD from the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, with certificates in African Diaspora Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Dr. Saffold's research interests coalesce around 20th and 21st century African American literature, hip hop studies, and the digital humanities. She is currently working on her first manuscript, Books and Beats, The Cultural Kinship of Street Lit and Hip Hop, and related digital archiving projects. She also has extensive experience as a scholar administrator with emphasis on enrollment management, inclusive diversity, and student success. Ultimately, Dr. Saffold is committed to widening access for minority students and shifting the culture in higher ed to be more inclusive through a prism of African American literature and culture. Our second presenter in this paper is Kirsten Scott, University of Pittsburgh. She's an assistant professor of English with a specialty in Black rhetoric and public writing. She actively contributed to the Routledge Reader of African American Rhetoric and has co-authored publications around the rhetoric of Blackness in digital spaces and multimodality. Kirsten has taught a range of courses in writing and rhetoric focused on hip-hop writing, Black rhetorical traditions, the Black public sphere, and critical literacies and pedagogies. Her research lies at the intersections of cultural rhetorics, namely African American rhetoric, historiography, and digital humanities. Specifically, her work is centered on HBCU communities and the rhetorical affordances of institutional narratives for revisionist presentations of HBCU histories. Her current project challenges top-down presentations of HBCU narratives by exploring revisionist approaches to the institutional narrative genre through student newspaper publications, specifically those at her alma mater, Tougaloo College. She is a co-founder of DBLAC, a digital network and learning community of Black graduate students in composition, literature, and literacy studies. Thank you both, and we'll turn the screen over to you. Do y'all need some help getting the slides set up?
I'll talk while we get ready. You want me to just take over for a second? Okay, so, oh, there we are. So never mind, I didn't have to talk for you.
You should go ahead.
Okay. So it's really fitting that the conversations that preceded us were moving in a direction to talk about some of the challenges faced in the first cohort. And the language group, I think, really got a chance to see a larger representation of some of those issues of categories and how we define our engagement with the metadata. And so, as we know, the evolution of the English language changes so often. And it's something that is very culturally driven and very geographically situated, very biographically related. And so at once we saw the language group as a group that could really pair and feed off of the other groups to say like, well, what are you finding here? And let's see what kind of linguistic implications are arising. But we started to really hit a lot of walls, specifically in the first CLA meeting, where we got a chance to see the spreadsheet to say like, whoa, what Black meant in this decade is not how Black was being represented in this decade. And this is, even if we were able to chart and find things and place them on the spreadsheet, it was going to require a totally different layering of representation. And so we had a lot of conversations with Dr. Graham about what do we actually do with this. And I think that's what she was describing, in the sense of, it was really ambitious to say like, all right, everybody, let's just jump right into into the corpus and figure out exactly how to navigate it. And so what we did instead was begin to think about how our individual projects could really think through what it meant to interrogate language across book publications, the circulation of those publications, the audiences that were interacting then with those texts. And so we really began to think of like a network of language experience, and how the novels, well, Jacinta will talk about novels, and I'll more so talk about the publication of HBCU histories. And so are you fine with me just going ahead and going, Jacinta? Okay. So just to kind of give some insight into what I'm meaning here, I'm really leaning on Howard Ramsey's idea of what happens when you place the digital along the analog, specifically with the human. So when you decide to take a human experience and digitize it, what is allowed and what's disallowed? And so for me, very much similar to what Jada was saying about the limitations of these overlapping multiple representations of self, whether you're British and Black, or you're Caribbean living in the US now, like you were Caribbean born, but now you live in the US. How does that work? That these intricacies invite a very different engagement with language and how they're then represented in metadata. So for me, I began to question what happens when you tell a Black story, but you aren't a Black person. What happens when someone is speaking about a particular situation, experience, community, or narrative, but it's not from a Black author? How does that fit into this particular collection of material? And so I'm specifically looking at Tougaloo. Tougaloo is an HBCU in Mississippi that was founded in 1869. And much like, I'd say 85% of HBCUs, they were not exactly founded by Black people, although they may have been the beneficiaries. They were usually founded by missionary associations, land grant funding, and so forth. And so when you see the individuals who are penning the narratives around these spaces, they are usually presidents or alumni bases. And for Tougaloo specifically, the historical text was written by a professor who was there. She was a white woman, and a alum who was a Black man. And so it begs the question that if we are to include particular texts that highlight narratives in a particular way to invite a deeper understanding of how we engage with Blackness or how we engage with language, what are the limitations of the identity of the authors or the subjects that would allow them to be present, included, or not included in the corpus? And so what I've done so far is digitize the two published editions. They're both out of print. And I used a book scanner, really cool experience. And I think what BBIP allowed me to really engage is to see what was even possible. And so even in the limitations of the completion of the spreadsheet and navigating with our group, the language group, it was really helpful for Jacinta and I to begin to work together to see how our individual projects could manifest in these meaningful ways and make progress. And so I guess this is a reflection to say to the second cohort that it will be a very challenging experience, but not one that you can't handle, to say that there are ways to carve out your individual undertakings as you navigate the larger project. And so I think Jacinta's PowerPoint is ready now, and she'll kind of take our conversation in a different direction.
I will, but thank you. That was really good, and I completely agree. I actually wanted to start by talking about how I came to BBIP, and I think that began a few years before we even knew BBIP could exist. I happened to meet Kenton Ramsey at a Black Digital Humanities Symposium at Purdue, hosted by Kim Gallen. And that was really my first introduction into the digital humanities. At that point, I had, when I was working at Howard as a recruitment officer, I took advantage of the databases that they have, and was able to look through archived and digitized versions of Essence magazine. I was trying to actually go to the Library of Congress since I was in DC, but to access hip hop magazines. And every time that I went, they told me some kind of story about how I couldn't get them. So I started using the resources that I had at my disposal, which was the databases that Howard provides. And I started just looking at Black magazines from the 1990s and early 2000s, my research focus. And I rediscovered that Essence magazine was publishing a bestsellers list in the 90s and early 2000s. So this is an example of a list that was published in March 2001. These lists were categorized as hardcover fiction, hardcover nonfiction, paperback fiction, and paperback nonfiction. Each individual list had five slots, and the names on the list that appear are ranked by independently owned Black bookstores around the U.S. A Black woman named Faye Childs in the 90s was attempting to get published and was really frustrated with the similar story that she has, similar to Terry McMillan, to Omar Tyree, Eric Jerome Dickey, a lot of the very popular African-American authors of the contemporary period, all were being told the same rhetoric about not having, not having an audience that would actually buy these texts. And so Faye Childs' reaction to that was to devise a schema to collect economic data on how Black books move in Black communities, something that was already very much so of interest to me. And so what was really intriguing to me about the list was that a lot of the texts that I was attempting to talk about that have a lot of silences around them in the academy were very prominent on the list. A really good example of that is The Coldest Winter Ever by Sister Souljah. This book was the longest running title for fiction paperback on the chart. It appeared a total of 43 times. That is equivalent to nearly 4 years, and was actually consecutively listed for 29 months. The book retailed at 35% lower than the average fiction paperback on the list in 2000, the year of its publication. The Coldest Winter Ever demonstrated how hardcover fiction, I'm not sure why it's not, there it is, okay. Demonstrated how, things are disappearing and moving around, 1 second. The Coldest Winter Ever demonstrated that hardcover books with sticker prices above $20 $20 or up were extremely hard to sell to young hip hop audiences that were interested in mobility and the ability to pay. They were more akin to what it would cost for a compact CD or a compact disc. But alternatively, portable cheap pulp books that average between $5 and $12 would fly off the shelves at independently owned bookstores. And we found that to be true by the market success of The Coldest Winter Ever. Today, The Coldest Winter Ever is considered to be the canonical text within the street lit genre. It also has been very much so important to the foundation to hip hop feminism and really kind of understanding the turn of the new millennium for the urban the urban person coming of age. And the list provides a really good snapshot of the most prominent authors within that genre. In addition to that, I also wanted to provide another preliminary example. I put this on here a while ago, but I think that it's significant. I think a lot of us really hold Toni Morrison as the pinnacle of, or as a pinnacle of the kinds of Black authors that are accepted canonically, but also are extremely popular within the Black community. And so Toni Morrison has this kind of duality where she is popular, but she's also academic in ways that street lit authors and a lot of other kind of popular African-American literary or authors, excuse me, are not able to straddle that divide. And so I thought it was very significant to show that Paradise by Toni Morrison was published in the same year that The Coldest Winter Ever was published, but the Coldest Winter Ever was 9 times as popular, according to the Essence bestsellers list, than Paradise. And I think that it's really important to focus in on this, because oftentimes as scholars of African-American literature, we're most focused on showing certain aspects of African-American literature. But I really question what can be gleaned from focusing on the texts that the Black community has determined are, the texts that they are most interested in reading and passing along. It's important to note that street lit was an African-American popular fiction genre that straddled the digital divide with a distinct hip hop ethos at the turn of the 21st century. The genre was created partly from a surge of self-publishing and aligns with a tradition of popular African-American literature, grappling with the fantastically real depictions of urban living dating back to the early 20th century. Streetlit authors employed emerging digital technologies by circulating their work on hand-bound computer copy paper, releasing their work online via email and discussion forums, or releasing their stories as electronic books before Kindle created ebooks. They broached impolite subjects, including Black sexuality, domestic violence, and sexual abuse, while ignoring longstanding respectability politics. The genre demanded redefinitions of what coming of age for Black and brown youth meant, considering a shifting cultural terrain that was making room for the permanency of hip hop. Streetlit is how some African Americans have creatively responded to socioeconomic pressures, including the explosion of crack cocaine in North America, in major North American cities, Reaganomics, and the war on drugs. Other African American literary genres were invested in, while other African American literary genres were invested in reclaiming Afrocentric pasts or in envisioning new Afro futures. At the turn of the 21st century, streetlit was focused on politically re-articulating Blackness in the present. And I think that's really important, especially in thinking about the other groups and how BBIP in and of itself rests as a recovery project, and really kind of understanding that the critical nature of this work, of the Essence Book Project, is more so cover work than recovery work. A lot of these texts outside of the Essence bestsellers list have not been covered. And when we talk about there not being very many metadata schemas, that holds true for the ways that these works either have not been covered in, say, even Essence magazine, the kinds of choices that they made in the types of texts that they would feature in the magazine differ quite a bit from the most popular texts on the list. And so there are these kind of very critical silences around these texts that are most popular on the list that are demanding that we look at this work while we still have it available to us. A really good example of that is that I have been having trouble accessing parts of the list that are beyond 2010 because Essence magazine, in response to the economic recession of 2008, began putting the bestsellers list on their website to try and mitigate some of the kind of decline in readership that they were having in light of ebooks and, you know, the rise of social media. That means that part of the list, because it was behind a paywall, I no longer have access to. And I'm seeing that more and more things that were created in this kind of space between the analog and the digital by these authors as ways to innovate around gatekeeping practices in the publishing industry are being lost. A lot of the kind of forums that were on their personal websites are no longer available. A number of the kind of old interviews that they painstakingly uploaded to their personal websites and those sorts of things are no longer there. And so if we're not keeping a record of those things and intentionally folding them into the tradition of African-American literature, these things absolutely will be lost. And so I think that is one of the reasons why I am extremely grateful for BBIP and for the happenstance encounter that I had with Kenton that brought me to BBIP. I really truly appreciate how far my research has been able to go with BBIP. When I started this project was shelved. I did this work as part of my dissertation and I let it go. And I didn't bring it back up until I had the conversation with Kenton. And I really do want to say thank you to him and thank you to Mariema and thank you to everyone who has worked with BBIP to make this possible. Today, I am working on a grant application to be able to move the Essence Book Project forward. We were very grateful for Mariema and the BBIP team for beginning the process of finding and digitizing all of the titles that appear on the Essence Sellers list. There are nearly 1,000. That is a huge undertaking. So obviously we need additional support for that work. But when we are able to get that corpus of digitized text, we will be able to grapple with some of these similar questions about metadata categories. And so we're really excited about that work. And we're wondering, one of the kind of big questions on my mind is, how does the position of these particular novels, given that they at one point were considered to be popular, but today are considered to be rare, undercirculated texts, how does that influence how we categorize and understand and situate these texts?
Thank you. Thank you both. Those were great presentations. Commentary, questions?
I'll just point out that what you see, for those of you BPIP Scholar Cohort 2, what you see here is an example of sort of a ready-made project, I guess I would say, that has not necessarily made it to the forefront. It's an important project. It's in process. And we know it's important. We know of its importance, but it would easily, and still could easily, fall into that dark black hole where books, you know, people are reading, you know that there's a huge readership and population of readers, but they are not counted, they haven't mattered, and the books were published in non-traditional ways by independent publishers or self-published. Some of them would get picked up. I mean, Coldest Winter Ever did get published. And Terry McMillan, of course, as we know, and I'm old enough to remember when Terry McMillan was driving her books around in the trunk of her car, and I started my career at the University of Mississippi, and she brought the physical books into the office and said, "Can you help me get this book?" This is before all of the hoopla around, Waiting to Exhale. And it was her first book, which I actually liked better, But those kinds of stories are the ones that I think BPIP does value, because for more than the fact that she brought 1,000 titles to our database, we started, maybe with a little over 2,000. She brought another 1,000, and we had people who were actually continuing to collect and didn't know what to do with the collections. So they gave them over to us, like Kathleen Bethel, who's been collecting for a very long time. She's a list person. So we have her lists, and we were finding those books. So it doubled the size of what we had originally collected and identified. So this is the kind, this shows you the diversity of what goes on in BPIP, but this project has sort of two sides to it. It's double-sided because it's a collection that comes into our midst that would otherwise not have access to, and the more she finds, the more we'll be able to add. But also, BPIP allows her to figure out what to do with it and to give it more juice, so to speak. It's a publication project. It's all kinds of things. The outtakes from this project are significant, and I think everybody's work has those kinds of outtakes. Kirsten, your work on Tougaloo, I mean, we've been talking about HBCUs and these hidden gems, and what do we do? How do we figure out how to bring that body of knowledge into circulation? So that project too was an individual project, but it also addresses the issue of language and everything else. And this is actually, the language issue is very, very big now as well. Computational linguistics is an arena that's very interesting to people. Again, above my pay scale, but I know that this is something we have to pay attention to. So you are hitting on all those right nodes in terms of what we have to look forward to and the challenges that it will be presented with. But that's just kind of for starters.
Other questions?
I'm seeing all the messages in the chat. Thank you so much. This is so interesting. Thank you. I'm not on Facebook anymore, but I might have to rejoin.
The chat is very fascinating. For those who aren't watching it, there's a discussion about book clubs assigning some of these texts. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. Do we have any more questions, discussions? I guess I'll turn it over to Sarah and Mary Emma then. Thank you all very much for such wonderful presentations.
Do you have anything else, Dr. Graham?
I was going to try to give people an update on where we were, but hearing all the presentations today, I don't know if I can make a logical narrative that pulls it all together, except to say that everything you all are talking about is the direction in which we think we need to go and that we are going. We can't do it alone. So I'm out there seeding, the ground, trying to figure out how we can get to do what we need to do in terms of looking more closely at the issue of metadata, in terms of collections that have yet to be identified and, as Jacinta says, covered, not recovered, but covered, because there is a body of, there's always work that nobody's covering. It's just, people are reading it, we know it exists, but it's not being covered. And of course, issues about language. So that is one of the big areas of, of our 4 major areas: bibliography, space, place, region, or language is one of them. So this particular project demonstrated some of the issues around language. Certainly in that Essence collection and hip hop genre, you're going to be dealing with issues of language. So you'll be hearing from me when I can put some of this together in a rational manner to point out some questions that we're raising and how we need to address them collectively, and where we go to get the kind of support and the technology and the skill to make it happen. So I think that's the best I can do at this point. As I said, I plan to say a little bit more, but I think I want to still think about how to bring these things together into a logical form.
All right, if there aren't any more questions or points of discussion, I think we can close a little bit early today. BBIP Scholars Group 1, if you have updates to your bio, would you please email those to me right away? I'd appreciate that. I can get our website updated, and I'll also be sure that the credits for the recordings of these sessions are accurate. Thank you so much, everybody. This was fantastic.